Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second video on competency-based medical education and how to approach that. And today we will be talking a little bit about assessment for competency-based medical education curriculum. And the reason for that is that, as you will see by the end of this presentation, that speaking about assessment is kind of crucial before you start designing your course, your curriculum, and the courses that lie in it. And this is why speaking about assessment becomes a priority rather than the conventional way to approach competency-based, other curricula, where you have to work with the design and then assessment follows. And I hope you will be able to see this by the end of this video. So let's just take a little background about what we said before. We said that number one, we have identified our competencies. Number two, we have broken them down into what we call enabling competencies, and we have mapped them. We've done this all by the end of the first video, if you remember. Having done that, finalized that, we need to start focusing on now what? Where are we going after this? And now, actually, we are speaking about assessment and the basic principles that go with that. So let's just take a look at assessment and how it looks like in competency-based medical education curricula. Number one, the first thing is that we have already identified a need for assessment to be time variable. There is an element of time variability, as you all know, so it cannot be stuck in stone. And this is why we have to revert to something called modern validity assessment frameworks. And what are these? Well, modern validity assessment frameworks, they have specific targets. Like any assessment framework has a target, the modern validity assessment framework also has a specific target. But what is a target? A target is what we need to be able to make a specific judgment based on the assessment data that we have. So what is the target when it comes to competency-based medical education curricula? Yes, you've all said it. The target here becomes the competency. There are many targets out there, like there's a knowledge component, there's skill component, professionalism, attitudes. But when it comes to competency-based medical education curricula, the target of the assessment framework needs to become the competency. And this is where it becomes really tricky, and you have to start focusing on your design. So we're back to the basic principles. What are the basic principles that we need to know? We need to know that there is a distinction between what we call assessment data and assessment judgment. So in multiple choice questions, for example, the questions themselves, they assess the knowledge, and this the data that comes out of them are the scores, if you can imagine. But guess what? The judgment that we can base on that is whether or not students pass, fail, whether there needs to be remediation, whether they can progress from year to year, whatever it is, the judgment is based on the multiple choice questions or the validated assessment tool that you have chosen. But assessment judgments that are based on assessment data in the clinical area are a little bit different, because you know they are different. They are based on faculty observation. So a faculty observer can be the source of the assessment data here because he observes behaviors, specific performance behaviors. They can coach and advocate, and based on specific milestones, they can make judgments on progression. What are these judgments in this part? These are called judgments of competency. They say whether or not the student here or the learner here is competent. I also want to draw your attention to another term that will be used, which is the assessment tool or the measurement tool. The measurement tool here is either a form, a checklist, or a test It merely provides a methodology for collection of data. So now we've spoken about the assessment data, the assessment judgment, and the assessment or the measurement tool that goes on along with that. Let's go back to another basic principle. Well, basic principles are the basic principle we will be speaking about now is the assessment decisions and how are these made and what are they. So assessment decisions are maybe pass, progress, maybe the student needs less supervision. All of these are assessment decisions. But you have to know in competency-based medical education curricula, decisions are either one of two categories. They're either formative decisions or summative decisions. Formative decisions are low stake. Low stake because decisions based on these decisions are not decisions that actually interfere with the student progression. But then there are summative decisions, and these are high stake. High stake, why? Because a lot of the student progression decisions are based on these summative decisions. So now take care, we're not speaking about the test, we're speaking about the decision and how it's designated. So it can either be formative or summative, as we have just mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about how to gather assessment data. What do we need to gather assessment data? How do we do that? Well, you will see that the competency in itself is really broad. So in order to be able to gather assessment data that is meaningful, we have to define construct relevant tasks within that competency. So these tasks are tasks where students can demonstrate behaviors and where someone can observe these behaviors, assess the students and make assessment decisions. So these can be either through students answering questions, discussing cases, or maybe demonstrating a skill. No one knows. It depends upon what definitive, construct, relevant task you have decided to rely on to assess your competency. Make sense? But take care. The innovation in assessment that is required when we are speaking about competency-based medical education curricula is huge. It is a complete shift in paradigm. Why? Because you know the isolated assessment tasks that we are used to doing at the end of the modules or at the end of courses, they no longer mean much when it comes to competency assessment. You will need to hire expertise, to rely on building experience in your faculty, and also to change a lot in the structure of your organizational chart, especially in the area of assessment and how assessment decisions are managed. And we will see this in just a few minutes. So you know that in order to make decisions and collect data, there are multiple sources of data. There are sources that were not used before, and collectively, they can make data collective judgment and utilize data for collective judgment. And also assessment here, it needs to demonstrate some kind of continuity in order to be an assessment that is fit for competency-based medical education curriculum. But the major aspect of competency-based medical education curriculum is the time flexibility aspect. So how do we manage that? Especially that it is consuming for faculty time and faculty effort. Not just that, it shows considerable demand. It offers or exerts considerable demand from the administrative and logistic point of view and the resources of the institution. Especially when you have this scheduling of multiple schedules where you are trying to extract opportunities for student assessment. Flexible and continuous assessment also, it's difficult to accommodate with the rigid scheduling of high stakes exam. Especially if my students will be sitting for high stakes exams, like for example, the IFOM or the USMLE, and we need to integrate our program against that. There is also increased assessment flexibility that it requires that CBME will necessitate significant organizational restructure, as we have just identified and spoken about in the last slide. But The time variability may also be beneficial. How? Because there is no longer a need to do full assessment for all your students at specific points of time. So it becomes more of a flexible assessment plan that goes along your whole program. I know it's very hard to digest, but once you grasp that concept, once you know how that is done, once you plan it first, you are able to go back and plan your teaching accordingly. And thus it becomes an element that allows you to intake more students that you were allowed to take before on conventional assessment and teaching practices. But now, how do you manage the assessment data? Well, CBME assessment, it requires data that is coming from multiple sources, and we all know that. But it also requires a greater level of data sharing, data management, and communication. Maybe your system is not quite equipped for that. So try to equip your system for that. And this is where student information systems, they come in very handy. The logistics of that and the ethics of communication around trainee data and ethics and secrecy and data secrecy and data security, it becomes really challenging. Electronic portfolios come in handy here because students, they could just pull everything into electronic portfolios and then you get to assess. But take care, this is a little bit subjective. So there is more relying now on what we call mobile-based applications or mobile-based inputs. Like, for example, we are using an application called Competency AI to be able to log in and utilize student scores on Mini CEX for collective collective understanding of how to make student input-informed judgment based on continuous assessment. Learning analytics and mobile technologies, they will need to be utilized because guess what? Assessment is no longer the same. It's going to be really different. But there is a problem because there is a little bit of element of context specificity. What does that mean? It means that assessing any performance in a specific setting and a specific situation or a specific case does not perfectly predict how a student will perform in even similar cases. And this is a problem. So you see, in order to be able to design this well, you need to understand that your data, your information about student performance needs to come through multiple assessments by multiple observers and in a variety of contexts. It becomes really, really challenging here to plan. But not just that, there are also elements of competency that are not as explicit as you want them to be. Like, for example, the degree of professionalism that the student needs to demonstrate. That's not really explicit. So you need to be able to weave this into your assessment plan in order to make sure that you are assessing the competency correctly and making meaningful decisions based on that. What are the implications of making assessment judgments when it comes to competency-based medical education curriculum? What's the implication? Huge implications can be made on that. See, there are formative and summative judgments, as we said before. There are different, but in competency-based medical education curricula, we consider them different ends of the same spectra. Like, you can continue doing assessment data that is on a formative spectrum, and at the end, this leads into a summative judgment that you can make. So an assessment activity per se is neither formative nor summative when it comes to competency-based medical education curriculum assessment. And this is how it's different from a conventional assessment construction. So in conventional assessment, conventional curriculum, we will do formative assessment and then we will do summative assessment. It's different in competency-based medical education curriculum assessment. It's different because a single assessment activity is either this or that. It's neither. It's just an assessment activity that feeds into what we will call a summative decision for the student. And now I want to mention two important things that I will not be discussing in this video, but they will come in other videos to follow. Programmatic assessment, and this is what we need to be working with, and entrustable decisions. Just keep these two elements in mind when you are thinking about your assessment until future videos when we will be discussing. Now we're finished with that, and we need to think about standards. How are we going to set our standards for assessment decisions? So standards or criteria for performance, they define how we make the decisions. And our decisions are either the student is competent or not when it's in competency-based medical education curriculum. These standards can either be quantitative, like we make quantitative decisions on percentage on which we will consider as a cutoff value, and we use standard setting criteria methods like ANGO, for example, to determine that cutoff, or we will use qualitative, informative data that describe a given performance level. And this is why we will need to describe different milestones that the student needs to progress against. So the third thing we will need to discuss in detail is how are we going to identify the milestones that students progress against, and how are we going to put criteria for supervision or criteria for informed evaluation for these milestones. So in competency-based medical education assessment, we will need to work with things like behavioral anchors for rating scales, like this is what a student needs to do in order to be considered as competent when I am taking a look at their performance by a rating scale, using a rating scale. Or detailed description of what a competent individual performance needs to look like. We need faculty development in order to calibrate sets of criteria that describe each milestone, and multiple subjective assessments at the end that feed into a meaningful perspectives on a learner performance. And this is how competency-based medical education assessment is different. So if you have a competency-based medical education program or curriculum, please, please, please do not have an assessment strategy that goes with that identifies assessment with a cutoff of 60% or 70%, or that identifies progression by single station achievement in one specific exam. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Don't call it a competency-based education curriculum if your assessment is not competency related. And then the final most important thing that comes up here when we speak about competency-based medical education assessment is that transitions and individual plans, they become really crucial in decision-making of student progression. So any assessment that is done, we need to exert effort to understand how the performance of student and the learner data that feeds into our decision will identify weaknesses of students and students that need to go into remediation, but not just that. It also needs to open doors for students to go through a rather maybe promoted or a self-progression that is higher than the rest of the group. This is how individuality or individual learning needs to be in competency-based medical education curriculum. I've heard it before, people saying, let's agree here that competency-based medical education does not work in medical curricula because medical curricula, they need to be more structured. I don't agree. You should not agree too. Otherwise, don't ever try to approach a medical education curriculum that is supposed to be competency-based in a conventional way. But then When we do that, we will need a different system for making assessment judgments. We will need something called a clinical competency committee that will make decisions on entrustment and decisions on how we progress our students. So we will call it progression committee, clinical competency committee, whatever you need to call it. But at the end, this committee will need to collect, review, synthesize assessment data, and then organize methodologies on how to define the competencies and whether or not the competencies have been achieved. They utilize this data to make judgments related to each and every student and see whether the student has the capacity to progress in the curriculum. This structure would and should support the implementation of a truly time variable education process by saying whether or not this student can have an accelerated progress into the educational system. And this is where it becomes really difficult. Let's sum this up. Assessment of learning outcomes has always been the essential to all levels of medical education. It's different now because when competency-based, time-variable education comes in, it places particular demand on assessment quality, frequency, purpose, and management that exceeds the traditional requirements. As competency-based medical education programs, they increase, they multiply, they mature, they become better. We need to invest more time, money, and talent into the assessment methods and into the systems that will allow the curriculum to grow. Thank you so much for tuning into this video, and hopefully you will be able to join us in the coming videos where we will be speaking more about programmatic assessment and entrustable professional activities and how these are done. Not just that, we will also start tackling how to start managing the design of your competency-based medical education curriculum. Thank you so much. See you soon.